Welcome to Train Signal. This is the video for Lab 1 of the Windows 2000 DNS, Building a DNS Infrastructure for Wired Brain Coffee Incorporated Mega Lab. In this Mega Lab, we're going to discuss many things, including how to install and configure DNS, setting the primary DNS suffix, creating forward and reverse lookup zones, and also creating host and PTR records on the DNS server. After we've configured that, we're going to go over to the DNS client and do some testing from there, see how NS lookup works. Okay, before we get started, I want to make sure that you've actually gone through the steps and procedures to set up your test network correctly. And if you haven't gone through the lab setup video already, I would encourage you to go through this. If your systems are up and running and you can ping and talk to each other on the network, then that's a good start. You also want to make sure that your systems are fairly pristine. If your systems have a lot of different programs installed, that can also lead to problems in this lab. Okay, if you're all set, let's get started. First thing we're going to do, we're going to take a look at our test network, and this is actually representative of Wired Brain Coffee Incorporated. And a little bit of background on Wired Brain Coffee. They're a small startup company located in Seattle. Currently, they only have 15 employees in the company. And your job as a junior network administrator is to set this company up and get them running and off the ground. In the future, this company is going to expand and grow to a much larger company. But for right now, you just need to make sure that the users that are currently there are able to communicate, get out to the internet, and do some just general file sharing. When you look at our lab here, this is SRV1, and this is going to be the first computer you're going to be working on here in Lab 1. IP address is 192.168.1.201 with a 24-bit subnet mask, putting us on the 192.168.1 network. You'll notice that DNS is going to be installed within this lab. Also on our network, we've got a basic file server here, and we won't be using this computer in Lab 1, but this is SRV11 for right now. 15 Windows 2000 professional computers, and a router here giving us basic internet access. Okay, one more thing to point out. I like to stress TCP/IP concepts to students, and I always have issues with people figuring out default gateways and understanding the concepts with that. So take a look at this router. If you're not familiar with a router, routers sit between two different networks and connect them together. And most routers have at least two interfaces. And an interface is another word for a network card. If you look right here, we've got a network cable coming into this internal side of the router, and the IP address is assigned 192.168.1.200. This IP address, notice, is the same network ID as 192.168.1.201. So these computers, the Windows 2000 Pro machines and my two servers, they're able to communicate with the internal side of this router. Okay, and this is how it'll be set up on any company network. You should be able to communicate with this internal side of the router. This then will be the default gateway. On the external side of the router, and I'm calling it external, this is still within the company itself. Okay, but this cable here, it's going to plug into a wall. So if I were to draw a line right here, this would be where the telecommunications company takes over. And this is connecting off to the internet with some sort of telecommunications, DSL. In our case, we're running a fractional T1 at 384 kilobits per second. Okay, that'll get us started. Let's proceed forward then into the first lab. Okay, once again here, just to remind you, this is our Windows 2000 Pro machine, and you know that because I have this big logo here, as well as Client 1 renamed on my computer icon. We're going to connect out to SRV1 through Terminal Services and do our DNS configuration from there. Okay, so I type in my password. I don't have a password here. And you know that this is SRV1 two ways. One, you've got the black background. I have distinguished this between SRV11, which will have a blue background, and two, I've renamed the My Computer icon with SRV1. First step in this process is going to install DNS. So we're going to go to Start, Settings, and Control Panel, then to Add Remove Programs, Add Remove Windows Components, and from here we're going to click down to Networking Services. Here's my first gotcha point to remember. I have had some students before click this checkbox, and when you click this checkbox, be aware of what happens. it installs all these sub-services underneath networking services, and that's not what we want. Installing all these different services usually causes a lot of problems on your server, so you want to avoid doing that. So what I'm going to do here is cancel, uncheck this box, and there's two ways of getting into this, the subcomponents of networking services. I can double click on this, or I can select it once and then click on details. Okay, now I'm going to go down to DNS, domain name system, select that, and click OK. Next, I'm going to click my next button. And this screen here, you probably will not have this pop up unless you're running terminal services on your system as well. No big deal. It's just confirming how I have my terminal services set up. It is in remote administration mode, which allows me to connect over to the servers from my Windows 2000 Pro machine. So I click next here, and now it's going to copy some of the files from the CD over to my computer. Here it prompts me for the CD, and I've copied my source files over to the hard drive, and I recommend that you do the same unless you have a very small hard drive. So when I click OK here, I'm going to browse and go find my source files. Let me show you where these are located. Right off my root, I've got a C drive here. I've copied the i386 folder off of the CD-ROM. So these are my source files. Otherwise, you'd have to put the CD-ROM in and just locate them off of the CD-ROM drive. So no big deal there. Click Open, OK. Notice the path here, C:\i386 specifying the source files, and the copying process will continue. This will just take a second or two here, and then we'll have DNS up and running. OK, click Finish, Close, Close, and now let's go take a look at our DNS console. DNS down here in the bottom. I open up DNS and see a couple things here. One, SRv1, so it's identifying the actual server where DNS is installed. When I open this up, and I always like to drag this so I can see everything that's going on here, I see two different folders, one called forward lookup zones and one called reverse lookup zones. When we click on these are still empty. So at some point here we're going to configure a forward lookup zone. Before we do that though, I want to show you one piece that's real important that you make sure you take care of as well. So I'm going to close this. And what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about setting the primary DNS suffix on your computer. And this setting is very important because right now we're not running in a Windows 2000 domain environment. If we were in a Windows 2000 domain environment where we actually installed Active Directory, it would take care of this setting for us. Okay, so I'm going to Network Identifications, Properties. Notice my computer name here. It's just SRv-1. To make this computer set up and work within the DNS infrastructure that we're going to set up, I'm going to have to change this to the name we decided on for our DNS structure. And you may not be aware of this yet, but as a company, Wired Brain Coffee has agreed on wiredbraincoffee.com. So I'm going to go ahead and type that in. Okay, let me double check the spelling. Very important that you get this spelled correctly. If this does not match up with the actual zone name that we're going to create in a little bit, you will have issues. Okay, so wiredbraincoffee.com looks good. Make sure that you check this box. Probably it's not going to affect us. But in a test lab environment, for sure, when you're changing things around a lot, it's nice if this DNS suffix is automatically changed when your computer's domain membership changes as well. Okay, click OK. Notice the full computer name now. WiredBrainCoffee.com has been appended on to server-1. This represents what's called a fully qualified domain name. Okay, it has the host and both components of the domain name here, making a fully qualified domain name. And this is very important within DNS. Okay, I'm going to click OK here, and I must reboot the system. So click OK, and I'm going to pause the video here and pick back up here in a second. Okay, we're back up and running here, and back on SRv1 once again, just to remind you, and let's go take a look, make sure our setting took hold. So go over to Properties, Network Identification, and I do see srv-1.wiredbraincoffee.com. So like I said, that's real important. We need to have that set up. It's a good idea to have that set up before we even start working with DNS. Next piece, we're going to go into the DNS console once again and pick up from where we left off when we exited that piece before. Once I open up DNS, I'm going to expand SRv1, and we're going to add a forward lookup zone. To do this, I click on New Zone, and we'll start walking through the New Zone wizard. Now we have a couple choices here. And first, Active Directory Integrated is grayed out, and the reason it's grayed out is because we're not running Active Directory. Makes common sense, I think, or it's common sense. We need to have Windows 2000 running with Active Directory installed, otherwise we can't run Active Directory Integrated zones. So our two choices then are Standard Primary and Standard Secondary. And the description offered here is actually pretty good. Okay, stores a master copy of the new zone in a text file. And this is good here because you need to understand how a standard primary works. This is the traditional way that DNS runs. And if you've heard of Unix bind before, Unix is just a competitive operating system that works with Microsoft. It's an older version, but a lot of companies still run Unix. And specifically bind is a type of software, a piece of software that runs this DNS on Unix systems. But I bring this up because they still use the standard primary and secondary. And if you're integrating with Unix bind servers, a lot of time you'll be running, standard primary or secondary to better integrate with your Unix servers. Back to the point here on standard primary though. The very first zone you create is creating a database for a particular zone. So for example, we're going to be creating one for wiredbraincoffee.com. And when I set that up, in the next screen I'll be able to specify the name of that actual zone. When I specify this, it's going to create a database on this system. And then any computers that are pointing to me for name resolution of wiredbraincoffee.com will have that name information resolved from my local database. Let's walk through this and take a closer look at how this actually works. First here is where I specify my zone name. And this is where I was talking about before. It's very important that this matches up to, oops, got a space in there. It's very important that this matches up to, can't spell today, the primary DNS suffix that we were talking about before. Okay, let's move the book out of the way here. Brain. Okay, wiredbraincoffee.com. If this does not match the primary DNS suffix, your DNS server is not going to be successful in resolving host names. So that's important that you do that. Okay, so I've named that forward lookup zone. Next piece here is I'm going to name the actual database that's saved on the system itself. Okay, so this is the name of the actual file, wiredbraincoffee.com.dns. And you can change this. I could type over this if I wanted to, but there's really no point. You might as well leave this name. It's the default name. Okay, so I'm going to click Next, and then Finish. Verify here now. You should see a new zone created, wiredbraincoffee.com. When we click on it, it does have some records. We're going to take a look at these here in a second. Okay, so this is our zone that we created. And now let's go back and talk about what we were dealing with before, make a little bit more sense possibly. Now that I've created this wiredbraincoffee.com zone, it's created a database on this local system. Within this database, it's going to contain resource records very similar to this one resource record that you see here. This was generated automatically. Since I just installed the forward lookup zone on SRv1 itself, it was smart enough to put a host record for its own computer name right here. So how this works then, SRv1 is resolved to this IP address 192.168.1.201. If a computer on the network was out looking for SRv-1, this computer would be able to resolve that IP address by looking in the database. Now obviously this isn't going to work too well right now. We've got one computer and one IP address here. For this to work properly, we need to have host records for every single different system in the network. Okay, so let's take a look at how we might create one. And the first thing we're going to do is create a static host record. So I'm right-clicking over here on wiredbraincoffee.com. I can also right-click over here in the right-hand portion. It doesn't matter where I do it. And I'm going to click on New Host. When I click on New Host, it brings up my new host window, and it's going to allow me to type in the name of the computer here and then an IP address that I want to specify. So we're going to create a host record for our other server in the network right now. And that server is SRv11, SRv11. And the IP address of that computer is 192.168.1.211. Okay, this is another option. We're going to talk about that here in a second. We're not going to check this box, and I'm going to click on Add Host here. Tells me here the host record's been successfully created, and this will allow me to continue creating static host entries for as long as I want. I'm going to click Done, and we go back here and take a look, and my database now has a new entry in it. Now, if a computer is coming to me for DNS name resolution, I can now resolve two names, SRV1 and SRV11. If you ask me about SRV15, I don't have that entry in my database. I'm going to return an error message to you indicating that I can't resolve that particular name. So once you get going, it's really fairly simple with how you create this. Okay, the next thing we're going to do, we're going to take a look at our reverse lookup zones. So I'm going to open this up and notice there are no reverse lookup zones currently. And it's important to talk about what a reverse lookup zone is actually for. A forward lookup zone resolves host names to IP address. So if a client talks to me and wants to know the IP address for an SRV-1, I return to the DNS client the IP address 192.168.1.201. If the client wants to know the actual host name for an IP address, that's generated from the reverse lookup zone. So paying attention here, if a computer wanted 192.168.1.211, they wanted the host name for that particular IP address, that would be returned out of the reverse lookup zone once we create that. If you have no reverse lookup zone created, you're obviously not going to be able to generate this information because it can't be generated from the forward lookup zone that we see here. Reverse lookup zones in Windows 2000 are commonly used for troubleshooting purposes like NS lookup, if you've heard of NS lookup. If you haven't heard of NS lookup, we're going to run through that in a second here and talk about how we can troubleshoot Windows 2000's DNS using it. Okay, let's create a new reverse lookup zone. So I right click on reverse lookup zone, I go to new zone. Next. Once again here, I'm going to create a standard primary. Standard primary is creating the master copy of the new zone. And we'll talk about standard secondaries in our second lab. So we'll kind of put that off for the time being. Here, instead of identifying an actual host name, we're going to identify the network ID of our network. Okay, so this is referring to the network ID of the IP address that you want this computer to resolve network IDs for. So I'm going to type in 192.168.1 because this is the network ID. If you're familiar with TCP/IP, and hopefully you are, because it's very, very important, not only for DNS, but the whole Windows 2000 curriculum and understanding networking in general. But here you see 192.168.1 representing our network ID, and our host portion is blocked off. We don't need to worry about that. Down here, notice what happened as well. You can specify the name yourself. This is going to be the actual name of the file that represents this reverse lookup zone. But if you specify it here, it's automatically generated for you. When I type in 192.168.1, down below you see this file created for you automatically. Okay, I'm going to click Next. Do I want to change this file name? Really, once again, there's no reason to do this. Every once in a while, if you're in an emergency situation or you want to back up your DNS database and put it onto a different DNS server, you might have a reason to specify this setting, okay, and then you could specify another file. But for us right now, there's no reason to change our file name or specify a different file. Okay, so we'll leave the default name. Click Next, and our last setting here, just verify your settings. Not too many to verify, so it shouldn't be too difficult. And we'll click Finish. Okay, that creates our reverse lookup zone over here. And we've got our two default records, our start of authority record and our name server record, just like we saw within our forward lookup zone. We're going to talk about more about those in Lab 2 as well. But for right now, what do we have here? We don't have any host records. Okay? And it's important to note that because host records, first off, don't exist here, and they never will, because you don't create host records within reverse lookup zones. What we create here are called pointer records, or PTR records. What we're going to do here is specify the PTR record for server 1, which is 201. If you notice over here, you get the full network ID 192.168.1. Okay, here you specify the host ID of the actual computer you want to specify. And then you browse for the host name. Okay, notice what I'm doing here. I click on Browse. I'm double clicking the DNS server. I'm opening up the forward lookup zone, so that corresponds to what you see over here. I'm opening up the actual forward lookup zone, the name of it, wiredbraincoffee.com, and I'm finding one of the host records to associate this IP address with. Okay, and that matches up with this host record, so I'm going to specify this host record, click OK again, and I now have a PTR record. Okay, so if I wanted to have a client be able to find my computer based upon its name and have an IP address generated, this PTR record and this reverse lookup zone will do the trick for me. Okay, let's go back to our forward lookup zone here and show you what else you can do when you're statically creating host records. We're now going to create a host record for the Windows 2000 Pro machine on our network, Client 1. Okay, and the IP address of this machine is 192.168.1.1. And here's where this checkbox comes in. If I select this box to create an associated pointer record, PTR record, and then click on Add Host, it's going to automatically create a record for me in my reverse lookup zone. Okay, so let's click OK here, done, and go check that out. First, within my forward lookup zone, I see Client 1, 192.168.1.1. So as I mentioned before, we've just populated this database further. If another system is looking for Client 1, based upon the host name Client 1, it'll get this IP address back, 192.168.1.1. Now that I'm looking at the reverse lookup zone, I don't see the entry there currently, but what I'm going to do is right-click and refresh, and we see this pop up now. That happens a lot. Sometimes if you just click from window to window, it'll open up and actually refresh this, but sometimes you have to manually refresh it yourself. Okay, and sometimes it's really stubborn. You have to actually close the DNS console itself and then reopen it to make some of these records appear sometime. So don't get discouraged. That's pretty, I guess, par for the course. Okay, next thing we're going to do is we're going to work on creating a couple more records. So this is something that you're going to do on your own and create these PTR records within the lab. But we're also going to do some practice here, and I'll give you an idea of how this works as we populate our database. Okay, so I'm going to add a couple more servers that will eventually be in Wired Brain Coffee's network, just for practice right now. So I'm going to create a host record for SRV10 and SRV2 here in a second. So IP addresses 2.168.1.210. Automatically generate that PTR record. Okay, and to be efficient, it keeps the window open. 192.168.1. Okay, and this is going to be 202. Okay, so now we have 5 different host records. Go over to our reverse lookup zone. Same thing, we only see the 2 PTR records. So I'm going to refresh this screen, and I see 4 different PTR records. And the one we're missing, I don't know if you caught this or not, but originally we created SRV11 by itself. That was before we created a reverse lookup zone. We're going to have to manually create this. Okay, so we're just going to go back here, give you one more chance to see how we do this anyway. New pointer. Here I'm going to give the actual IP address of that computer, which is 211. And then we're going to browse for SRV11. Go back up here real quick and show you this once again. DNS servers, SRV1, forward lookup zone folder, the name of the forward lookup zone, and then we're finding the actual host record itself to associate with that IP address. Okay, here's the one we want. 192.168.1.211 is now associated with this host record. A client machine looking for 211 will have this host name returned to it. Okay, so I click OK here, and now we see our 211 record as well as the other ones. Okay, now that we've set this up, we're going to close out of here. We're going to go test DNS by configuring a DNS client. So I'm going to close actually DNS here, and we're going to log off SRV1 and go back to Client 1, our base system. Okay, so we're on Client 1. What I want to do, let's go check my IP settings first to make sure that we're all set to go with that. Network card properties, TCP/IP properties, and my preferred DNS server needs to be set to my one and only DNS server in my network right now, which is 192.168.1.201, so this looks good. Couple notes here on this preferred and alternate DNS server. You need to be aware of what the difference is. People are very commonly confused by this. Once we have a primary and a secondary DNS server, they start matching up the preferred and the alternate DNS server with primary and secondary, and it doesn't have to be that way. Okay, half your company can be pointing to one DNS server as its preferred DNS server, and half your company can be pointing to another DNS server as its preferred DNS server. Okay, the alternate is just there in case the primary, or I'm sorry, the preferred DNS server is not available. Okay, so we've got that set up. Let's go take a look at a couple things we can do to troubleshoot this and make sure that this is configured correctly. And I should note, by the way, once this is here, make sure you click OK. Okay, if you don't click OK all the way out of this whole menu here, it's not going to hold your changes. So I have a lot of students who will close or cancel. It's not going to work. OK, OK. All right, so we're going to go to a command prompt by going start run cmd. Once I'm at my command prompt here, now I'm going to be running the DNS troubleshooting tool called NSLookup. Okay, so you type in NSLookup, and there's another misspelling. Missed my O. Is it me or is it the keyboard? Okay, NSLookup. I press enter, and this takes me into a subcommand. But before we talk about the subcommand, take a look at what you see here, because this is important. It tells you the default server, who you're configured as your DNS server, or who's configured as your DNS server, srv1.wiredbraincoffee.com, and the IP address is 192.168.1.201. Okay, so this is important to note as well. If this wasn't configured correctly, for example, if I were to go back and change my IP address here, not my IP address, but my preferred DNS server setting. Let's just change this to 202. Okay, so I've got that setting in place. Back to my command prompt, type NSLookup. You get this type of error message. Okay, if you see this, if NSLookup is not working correctly from the client or from any system, you've got DNS problems. And I might have said this before, but DNS problems will cause you more issues than anything else within Windows 2000. And it's very important that you have this worked out before you continue. So if you see this, you've got some issue, we need to make sure that we take care of that. Okay, so let me exit out of this and exit out of our command prompt for a second. Let's go back and set our DNS server back to the right setting first. Okay, and take a look at one more setting. The primary DNS suffix is going to need to be able to, or it's going to need to be changed. Okay, and this is the same thing we were dealing with before when we were talking about SRV1. So right-click Client 1, go to Properties, Network Identification, go to Properties again, and here our fully qualified domain name does not place us inside the wiredbraincoffee.com domain. Okay, what does that mean exactly? Well, let's take a look here. If I go back to my command prompt and run NSLookup, okay, no problems connecting. I can find server 1. It's responding and saying, yes, I'm out here. I'm a DNS server. I'm an IP address 192.168.1.201, and here's my host name, srv-1.wiredbraincoffee.com. What you can do from this subcommand in NSLookup, though, is actually type in other server names, other computers, and try to respond to them. And if I type in client 1, okay, it actually can't find it. Comes up with an error message here, client 1, and doesn't work. The reason this happens is because when we look over here, my fully qualified domain name does not match up. I'm not within wiredbraincoffee.com. Okay, so if I type in client 1, client -1, Okay, client-1.wiredbraincoffee.com looks good. Okay, now that works. Okay, so by typing out the fully qualified domain name, I can actually make this work. But what's going to happen, if another computer needs to reach me, I'm going to want to make sure my primary DNS suffix specifies that I'm within wiredbraincoffee.com. Okay, so to take care of that, what we'll do, go back here to More and set this primary DNS suffix once again. So once again, wired, double check the spelling, that looks good. Okay, and to reiterate this point here, normally if you join a Windows 2000 domain, this suffix will be appended. If I created a Windows 2000 domain named trainsignal.com, when this computer joined the domain, when I made this computer a member of the domain, trainsignal.com would be added here. It would automatically be part of the trainsignal.com domain. Since we're running in a workgroup environment with standalone servers, there is no domain. Okay, and what I'm focusing on here, within DNS, we've created DNS domains. That's different than a Windows 2000 domain. They're completely different things, different concepts. Okay, so to make this work for right now, you need to type in the DNS suffix, which is our wiredbraincoffee.com domain. Okay, so I click OK, and once again, I'm going to be asked to reboot here. Okay, so I'm going to pause the video here for a second, and once I reboot, we'll get back up and running. Okay, we're back up and running here, and first thing we'll do, let's go verify, check our settings, make sure that took hold. So I'm going to the properties of my computer, network identification. You do see here client-1.wiredbraincoffee.com. We will go one step further though. Take a look at our fully qualified domain name. Okay, so that indeed did work. Okay, and now we're going to go back into the command prompt, start run cmd, and we're going to use this ns lookup command. Okay, let's talk a little bit about ns lookup. Once again, ns lookup is a troubleshooting tool that's used to troubleshoot DNS problems. And one thing that confuses people at first is this little sub menu that it goes into. If you notice, when I typed ns lookup, it told me who the server was, DNS server, my preferred DNS server, and the IP address of that preferred DNS server. It also kicks you into this little sub menu here, and from this sub menu is where you run all of your DNS commands. Okay, so some people get lost in here and they try and run normal DOS commands, and that won't work. I don't know if you're familiar with this command or not, but dir shows the directory. If I type dir and hit enter, okay, you see right here, server 1, my DNS server, can't find dir, non-existent domain. So it's not able to resolve this host name to an IP address. I'm sorry, an IP address to a host name actually. So if I type exit here and try the same DOS command, no problem. Okay, so I'm going to type ns lookup again, go back into my ns lookup sub command here and show you a couple things. Okay, so one thing you can do here is type in host names such as client 1 and have it resolve, give you back IP addresses. Okay, so let's try this again. We've got client 1, let's try SRV 11. And recall, this is another host record that we previously created. Another PTR record actually is what you need for these. Works again. Okay, let's type in SRV2 for the host name. Returns to us the IP address 192.168.1.202. Let's type another one. Let's try SRV3. Okay, we didn't create an SRV3, so we get this error message here. All this information is coming straight from the DNS database. Another thing to note here as well, SRV2 does not currently exist within our network. Okay, so yeah, I put it into the DNS domain, but I don't have a physical machine here that's running SRV2. There's not a computer that has this IP address 192.168.1.202. So the DNS database works regardless. So you may get a host name resolved back to an IP address. It doesn't mean that computer is live and available on the network. So that's one thing to keep in mind. One more command we're going to run that you're going to see in your lab manual. It's called set type. And we're going to specify the type of record we're talking about here. So I'm going to say any record. And then we're going to specify our domain name, our DNS domain, which is wiredbraincoffee.com. When I hit enter here, it actually reveals all the information about the wiredbraincoffee.com zone. Okay, and this is just general information, revealing that a lot of this won't make sense to you right now, but this can help you out with very particular information on how the DNS server is configured. Okay, the serial number, the administrator that's responsible for that domain itself, the primary name server that holds the primary zone. Here we have a refresh interval. This is telling us how often the primary and the secondary DNS servers will exchange information. So how often zone transfers will be from the primary to the secondary. Okay, so just some general information. And what you want to note, this information here actually matches up with information that's on the DNS server itself. We'll show you that real quick before we finish up here. I'm going to terminal service back over to SRV1. Okay, I'm going to open up my DNS tool. And we're going to look at the properties on SRV1. Okay, let's go out here to the wiredbraincoffee.com zone, right click, and go to properties. If I go to the Start of Authority tab here, this is the exact same information we were just looking at a second ago, but in a nice graphical form. Okay, so that record it was actually showing us was the Start of Authority record. We saw the serial number, the primary server, the responsible person, and I spoke a little bit about the refresh interval. So just to match that up. Okay, so we're going to log off here and go back over to our client and verify that. Okay, refresh interval, responsible person, primary name server. Okay, we're going to wrap things up right there. Hopefully this has been informative, and we'll see you back real soon here when we get over to Lab 2.